The Cuyahoga County Finance and Budgeting Committee meeting for Monday, July 29th, 2019. Will please come to order, and I'll ask the clerk to call the roll.
Calling the roll, Mr. Miller.
Here.
Mr. Tuma. Mr. Tuma is absent at the moment. Ms. Simon.
Here.
Mr. Gallagher.
Here.
Mr. Schrein.
Here.
Ms. Brown.
Here.
Ms. Baker.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you very much. A very timely entrance by Ms. Baker. Do we have anybody signed in for public comment?
No, Mr. Chair, no one is signed in.
Okay, we have minutes from the July 15th, 2019 meeting. They're in your packet. And if someone has a motion, we'll put that on the floor.
Will we approve the minutes?
Been moved and seconded to approve the minutes from July 15th. Any further discussion? Hearing none. The vote is on the minutes for July 15th. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed say no. And for the record, Councilman Tuma is entering the meeting now. So we're all here. That's great. And we have one piece of legislation that we're going to do first. That's Resolution 2019-0169.
Resolution number 2019-0169, authorizing an amendment to contract number CE 1500160-13, formerly contract number CE 1300543-01, with AT&T Mobility National Accounts for wireless communication services and equipment for the period November 1st, 2013 to December 31st, 2018, to extend the time period to December 31st, 2021, to change the scope of services effective January 1st, 2019, and for additional funds in the amount not to exceed $4,500,000.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Andy Moles, interim CTO for Department of IT. I wanted to do a little brief background before we get into the initial plan. A little bit about the background. We ended up procuring a data plan for HHS iPads in 2013 for $90,000. But then we ended up in 2014, we had a massive RFP that we did, which included all the mobility. There was WAN, circuits, Centrex, measure business lines. It was quite a bit, 23 services of equipment. The original contract that we chose in 2014 was for $6.1 million for 4 years. What we're requesting this time around is $4.5 million for 3 years with AT&T. As you can see, with AT&T in general, we have the WAN links, the SIP amendment, Centrex, internet services. This has really become a broken wheel, and I'm sure you guys are getting tired of us coming late to the table, and I apologize for that. We are making provisions within our department to see if we can expedite things a little bit more efficiently, but we did have a lot of contract negotiations with this. It took a while between AT&T and us, and once we got all that done, then we had our internal issues as well. So we are late. I apologize. This is not gonna, I'm under my regime right now until whenever that is. We're gonna try to make it a better process to get them on the table early. Did we receive services? Of course. Have we paid any invoices? No. The services that really we have out there right now, it's kind of grown over the years. It was started off when I first got on in 2004, it was just normal cell phone service. Public Works, people, sheriffs, administrative people. But as you can see by the list, we've gone from these typical flip phones to smartphones, tablets. We got data cameras for the license plate reader. We use the SIM chips within these for the LPRs, for intersections, for the public service. Vehicle fleet uses the GPS, which uses the AT&T plans to track their vehicles. Data service tablets with HHS and Public Works. One of the biggest ones is really for the child care workers for HHS with the tablets. so they utilize them. I mean, we've gone, since I started 2004, I think we went from 500 devices to now over 3,000 devices, to be approximate, really 3,884 devices. So there's quite a bit. We rely pretty heavily on the Wi-Fi out there today. One of the reasons we were looking, I think one of your questions will be, why didn't we RFP? And I think the reason for that is because of this plan called FirstNet. FirstNet is a first responder unit that basically will work. It's solely, I have an AT&T representative, so we'll get into the finite details of FirstNet, but it's a first responder proprietary network. So, for example, if you're out, if we were experiencing a disaster, or let's just say the Cavaliers Parade, and we had a disaster out there, an emergency, and nobody can get on the cellular service, if our users, our first responders, were on the FirstNet carrier data plan, they would be automatically priority. They wouldn't have any busies. So that's kind of what we're rolling. We wanted to roll FirstNet into our data plan, which not only will save us money, and we'll go over that as well. We see a significant savings with having our current plan and having FirstNet included in there, almost like a sole source agreement. I think we talked about we have 900 devices that we already identified to roll over, and that includes our first responders out there with our sheriffs, public safety, caseworkers, you name it. We've identified those users. So use that as an example. If there was an issue out there with a caseworker that was at a house and doing some work, they would have priority if they were on the FirstNet plan. In case something happened, the cellular services were filled up or a disaster, they can still service their customer on site without any interruption. This is a slide. I'm not going to read through this. I kind of gave you a general overview of this FirstNet plan. This was actually a state agreement that AT&T was awarded, because of their GSA and state term. This was something that they were working on for quite some time. AT&T is the only provider of FirstNet. You're going to hear other vendors out there, which we had already, that came out and said, well, we'll do that too. But they're not part of the federal government entity, okay? We've already got FirstNet users out there, as you can see from the list: the city of Akron, Medina County, Canton, city of Lakewood. Gave you a brief example of how FirstNet works in that paragraph if you chose to read it. But it's already out there, it's already functional, it's already working. Our agreement right now is we're going to go and do an RFP in 2020. And what we're going to be doing is looking for cellular services during that time, because we didn't RFP initially. We're going to do it in 2020, which will allow us some time to build a plan for transition. If we had to transition our devices over, it would have taken almost 2 years to do. It was just, and I really didn't want to affect the impact of users that are out in the field today. It was just too much. 500 devices back in 2004, we went from Alltel to Sprint. That was a piece of cake. Going from, transitioning the SIM chips and all that stuff was simple. Now we got GPS, we got tablets, we have, over 4,000 devices. It would just take almost a year and a half to do. So our plan is to do an RFP in 2020, get a provider, cost-effective provider, and then build a plan to transition, because it's going to take that long. Because this contract goes to 2021. Any questions?
Please proceed.
Thank you. So when we go out for the RFP in 2020, for 2021, would we consider or anticipate that other companies would have the same service if only one Do other companies have federal or state contracts for this type of service?
To my knowledge, no, they don't.
So the RFP would contemplate maybe just one anyways?
It would be just one service data plan without FirstNet. And hoping maybe AT&T does win it, then we would be benefiting from having the FirstNet plan in place.
What do other counties, for example, use if they just don't have this FirstNet safety net? They have a different kind of equivalent?
I don't think they have any first responder service.
Okay,
They just have their regular data carriers for their users.
okay, thanks.
Other questions, Councilman Gallagher?
What's the opinion of the safety director?
I haven't really spoke to them. I did mention to them about the service in general, but I never got an opinion.
Shouldn't we have that?
I believe so. Yeah, I agree with you.
So why don't we do that before we pass this? I'm very uncomfortable. This goes back to the connectivity of the county. And it seems odd to me that we have people in place. You talk to the sheriff or anybody at the sheriff's department?
We've had meetings regarding the service and what it can do.
And what did they say?
They thought it was a great plan to have for their users.
And who are they?
I think we spoke with Brandy Carney initially, reached out to Alex Pelham.
Right. Those would be the two people I'd have in the audience right now. But they're not here. Is that a lack of them not being here, or are you failing to bring them in?
Maybe both. I mean,
Mr. Chairman, on that, I think we need some more input on this, but your call.
Okay, well, I would ask staff if we could take a shot at getting one or both of the people requested to come here immediately, and we'll continue with the discussion, and we may suspend it and start on the second quarter review and come back to it, but I think it's a legitimate question. Councilman Sean.
Following up on Mr. Gallagher, what other counties are utilizing the service in the state of the other 87 counties?
I had a list there. I think we had Medina County in there. We had Geauga County Sheriff's Department.
Have we spoken to both those?
I have not. They were references that we got from AT&T when we were thinking about doing this, because we asked if there was anybody else using it.
Yeah, when I go through the trouble to ask for a reference, I then pick up the phone and call probably some of the references that are listed, but the ones that are not listed are just as important to find out there. So it just seems to me that that's part of the due diligence if we're going to make a commitment, and especially when it sounds as though we're already cheering for them on the next round, even before we've even put it out for bid yet.
Okay.
So it just seems to me that we ought to be talking to others out there and find out, gee, you do have AT&T or you don't have AT&T. Who are you using if you're not using it? Because Lake County is obviously on one of our borders. We've got Medina County touching another one, but Summit County is right there, and it just seems to me that we would be talking to our neighboring counties that are right next door to us. Thank you.
So, Director, on the FirstNet, is it your intention in the next RFP that FirstNet and the rest of it is going to be handled separately? Is that what you're talking about?
It would be open for any cellular company to bid on the RFP. Based on what we position within the RFP and services, if we mentioned that we wanted a first responder network in there that is federally regulated, that would probably end up maybe cutting because there's really only one that I know of, and that's AT&T, who's federally mandated and state awarded.
So that's exactly what my question is. In the next RFP, are you going to specify a requirement that there's a federally approved first responder network in the plan, or which limits you to one vendor, or are you going to not make that specification and perhaps do the FirstNet part and the cellular part separately?
Unfortunately, I found out, asking questions regarding whether or not we can have a separate contract for FirstNet. I was told that it needs to ride on the same carrier network as AT&T. So there can't be two separate. We can't go with Verizon and go with AT&T. It's kind of all in one. But getting back to your question, that would be, knowing the savings that we're going to get from FirstNet, if this is awarded properly. I mean, we're going to significantly see probably about $1,000 of savings within the 2.5, 3 year period. Writing the RFP is going to be, if we want to be generic,
You're going to see how much savings?
we are going to see over $100,000 savings.
100,000, okay.
Yeah.
Ms. Simon?
I don't see why we wouldn't proceed with this. If you had a discussion with safety and they didn't voice objection and we're under a contract that needs to be addressed with our safety at risk, we're going out to RFP and assumingly we'll have input from that department. And I just don't see why we wouldn't want to capture a federal program in this contract until we can send out an RFP. There's really, if nobody's voiced objection, I didn't think it was the job of this speaker to get everybody in the room, necessarily department to department. I don't think that's your job to invite Brandy Carney in. In fact, it's probably the chair or the administration's job in general, not yours. So you listed what you could, and I would like to proceed, but I'm leaving it up to the chair.
So, Director, regarding pricing, I know it's like comparing apples to oranges because the amount of devices and the services are different, but comparing this pending contract to the previous contract, are the per unit prices generally more or are they less?
Currently, right now, you mean without the FirstNet?
I'm saying what we're paying for services under the new contract that we're proposed to enter into.
Mm-hmm.
Are we paying more per unit of service than what we're currently paying, or are we paying less?
We're paying less.
And can you give us some idea of how much less?
We're looking at probably 20%, 15% less than what we currently pay.
Uh-huh. And is that because of advances in technology?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Director, are you acting in the top position in the IT department?
As of right now, yes, I am.
And to your knowledge, has there been any process going on to determine whether you're going to be nominated for that position on an ongoing basis, or somebody else? Is there a process currently in place?
I was informed as of last week that this position will be posted, which I'm glad. I think it's mandated by the charter that it be posted. If you're going to ask me whether or not I'm going to apply for it.
I'm not going to ask that question. That's for you. That's for you to determine. Okay. To Khalil, have we been able to reach anybody from the public safety department? Any other questions by my colleagues? Okay. Hearing none, what I would like to do is simply table this temporarily and get started on the second quarter review and hope a little later on in the afternoon to come back to it and maybe get some information from public safety.
Okay.
Okay. I presume because of the lateness that if we feel we can move forward, that you would be asking for second reading suspension. Would that be a fair statement?
That is correct, sir.
Okay, fine. Okay. Okay, so then we're gonna simply hold resolution 2019-0169, and as soon as we find out whether or not we can get public safety here, we will go back to it. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
So now we're gonna revert to the second item on the agenda, which is the second quarter review, and I'm gonna call Director Keenan to the podium, and Director Keenan is gonna be speaking from the second quarter update slides that you have in front of you, but I would bring to everybody's attention that you also have in your materials the full 2019 mid-year update, which is a more detailed explanation of the same kind of things. And so when we get to the questions, any questions from either document will certainly be in order. So, Director, please proceed.
Good afternoon, Maggie Keenan, Office of Budget and Management. So as you noted, or we noted in the report, we've only reported on general fund and HHS levy fund. I can answer probably on the spot any questions about any of the all funds issues, but I can certainly get back to you if I can't answer those. But this presentation is largely just going to focus on general fund and levy.
I would predict that those two funds are going to get 95% or more of our attention.
They
so
always
I don't
do,
think,
but
I don't think you have a lot to worry
I
about.
don't want to exclude our special revenue funds.
Yeah.
So feel free to interrupt me if you have any questions. Starting with the general fund, based on our second quarter estimates, if we exclude some of our one-time capital expenditures, the general fund is balanced in 2019. And this is a pretty big deal. It's been a long time since we have been balanced. We do have some quote one-time revenue in there. We are drawing down the MCO transition funding from the state of Ohio. In 2019, that's $12.5 million. So as that goes away, we have some structural issues, but for the current year, we are balanced, which is good news. Like I said, we do have about $20 million in capital projects. This is above and beyond the annual spend for the capital improvements plan. So the $20 million, is largely for the Harvard Park Garage, the Cleveland Police Headquarters, what's happening over in the jail with some of the improvements, and then we are including some of the spend on the ERP. We are projecting operating shortfalls in the future 2 years, $20 million in 2020 and $33 million in 2021. We do have sufficient cash balances at this time to deficit spend through 2020, but if we were to cover that $33 million shortfall in 2021 with reserves, we would fall below the 25% minimum that is required by code. So looking specifically at revenue for the general fund, projected to total $451 million in 2019. This is about 3%, which is $13 million over budget and over what we had estimated in previous years. That's largely due to very strong sales tax performance and an increase in investment earnings. Sales tax is up so far through the June of 2019, we're up 5%. The budget had anticipated an increase of 2%. The $451 million does include the impact of the property reappraisal. For the general fund, that was an increase of about $2.5 million. Future years, we're projecting that revenue is going to go down, 444 million in 2020, 437 million in 2021. This reflects a few things. One, a decrease in the drawdown on the transition funding from the state. So as I said, we have 12.5 million baked into the revenue this year. Next year, that goes down to 8 million. And then after that, we're assuming draws of only 2.5 million for the next 4 years, at which time the funds will be depleted. We are assuming a decrease in investment earnings. That's from Treasury's estimate. So we're going down to 15 million next year from the 20 million that we're projecting this year. And then also, we will not have the transfer from the 0.25% fund to the general operating fund, because as you all know, we have consolidated those two funds, but that consolidation happened after we had already processed the transfer this year. So it's no net impact on the general fund, but it does decrease both revenue and expenditures. Any questions on revenue? Okay. So looking at expenditures, oh, sorry.
Ms. Baker.
Sorry,
That's okay.
trying to keep up. The property tax you said was an increase of 2.5 million?
Just for the general fund share, yes.
And then what was the sales tax, just the increase? What was that? What was that
So
number?
the budget had assumed 2%, and we are up 5%. So for 2019, I'm projecting 252 million in sales tax receipts, and the budget assumed 245 million.
252, 240? Okay, that's a nice increase.
It's it's a great increase.
So are you projecting the year end at plus 5% on the
No, I'm projecting year end at 4% increase. So we had pretty substantial year-over-year increases in the first quarter. We were up, offhand, I can't remember in what order it was, but we were like 8%, 11%, 13% year over year, and we have seen that level off. So the last couple of months, we've been kind of holding steady, but it's slight decreases. So I am assuming that it's going to level off and will be 4% by year end.
And what's the forecast for 2020?
In the numbers that you're looking at second quarter, we were assuming a 2% increase in both years. Based on some impacts from the state budget, I am have recommended and I'm pretty comfortable assuming a 3% increase for next year in terms of the budget.
So Chair, if I may, so we're looking at almost a $10 million increase in dollars we didn't anticipate between the increase in property tax and sales tax. That's pretty good.
It's great. Let's not downplay it. It's great.
We'll take it.
We'll take it.
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
So
Ms. Simon.
if I can proceed with the director on, with regard to the sales tax and expected revenue, and you're anticipating that to be a good year in 2020, what's the basis upon which you project that trend is continuing? Like, why is the sales tax up? Is it due to the events, the sports events? Why do you see, what's the connection, and why do you project a continuation through next year?
So unfortunately, I'm not able to isolate sales tax by zip code or by parcel or anything. So I can't, I would love to say it's due to sporting events. I can't necessarily say that is true definitively. For the first quarter of the year, it was actually the use tax. So I always say sales tax, but it is a sales and use tax. And actually the use tax was up kind of crazy high. So also as a result of the state budget, we have seen some, well, not just state budget, but after the Wayfair decision, the Supreme Court decision last year, Wayfair, South Dakota, a lot of the online retailers had started collecting the sales tax, even though in Ohio, they hadn't really acted yet legislatively, so they weren't mandated to do so, but they just did.
Michael, don't go anywhere.
We had already been collecting on the larger retailers, but we are seeing an increase. I think it's about $5 million that we're assuming will be the effect of the Wayfair decision. So I'm more comfortable attributing the overall increase to things like that. There has been a little bit of an expansion of what we're applying the sales tax to, more than the sporting events, but you know, I would hope against hope that is driving some of the increase in the numbers, or at least holding us steady with those numbers.
So thank you. No, I'm happier to hear there's another source of the increase rather
Yes.
than the unpredictable sports
Yes,
situation.
Okay.
okay.
Okay, so before you continue, we're gonna revert back to Resolution 2019-0169, the AT&T contract. So you
Oh,
can
okay.
take a seat for a moment, and I'm gonna I'm gonna call Councilman Gallagher back, and I understand that he has spoken with Director Carney and is going to give us a report.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I did contact Mrs. Carney. She has not, according to her, had any input on this for about a year. It went into IT with Mr. Young. She hadn't heard back, but from what she recalls and what she thinks is in the contract, what she knows is in the contract, she thinks it's a good idea to move forward, and that we're going to be needing this anyhow.
Okay. So, based on that report, is there a motion to move Resolution 2019-0169 to the full council with recommendation for second reading suspension?
So move.
Okay. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed say no. The ayes have it, and it is so recommended.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Okay. Tagging off once again, and back before us is Director Keenan. Sorry about that interruption.
That's okay.
Okay.
Okay. So moving on to general fund expenditures, unless we had any other questions on the revenue?
Okay.
Okay. Expenditures are projected to total 471 million in 2019. This is about 8% under approved appropriation levels, but it is consistent with, largely consistent with first quarter and what we had assumed last year for 2019. The differences largely are attributed to the change in the chart of accounts. And that 471 does include 20 million in what I will refer to as one-time capital project spending for the large-scale projects. Expenditures are projected to decrease slightly in the future years, 464 million in 2020 and 470 million in 2021. Those estimates do assume a salary adjustment, cost of living adjustment to salaries of 2%, and it does assume a 3% increase in the employer share of hospitalization. We also have included in there, there's some changes to expenditures when we know there's a change for a contract or debt service or something like that. But largely the increase is due to payroll costs, and the decrease from the current year is because of those larger capital projects.
Yes, Councilman Sean.
Are you projecting ranges at all in the area of litigation?
No. We project, I can get you the exact number, but we do assume a handful of expenses for, what we call the self-insurance fund. So this year it's about 900,000, next year 500,000, the next 2 years about 500,000. That's the more kind of routine settlement expenses, but no, I do not project litigation expenses. I wouldn't know how, for one thing. I've heard some estimates, but I'm not confident with those estimates. I have nothing to substantiate that, and we certainly wouldn't want to bake those in as we're negotiating.
Well, I understand that the element of the damages you wouldn't necessarily want to bake in, but I would assume that the actual trial costs and administrative costs of the attorneys is something that we should be able to get at least a budget from our counsel in regards to, and give you some advice as to what outside counsel is going to cost us.
Well, we only got the estimate for the outside counsel. It's not in the numbers, the 500,000, right? So we only got the estimate for the outside counsel when we presented it on the last fiscal agenda. I put it on the agenda as soon as I knew about it, and that was after second quarter. So we were not notified how much the attorneys would cost.
You haven't been notified, but would it make reasonable sense to ask the administration? Because I think it's going to be a big number.
The council can rest assured that I ask, but I was not told what the number will be until after we publish our second quarter report.
Okay, thank you.
Director, what was there in the state budget that affects the general fund that's significant?
So the most significant impact was the increase to the reimbursement from the state public defender for indigent defense. The budget assumed, right now we're at 42% reimbursement, and the state budget assumed going to 75% in the first year, 100% in the second year. For us, that would be about $9 million next year and $12 million in 2021, which is fabulous. And I see you look excited, but I do want to provide some caution to that the state public defender himself is encouraging counties to increase their spending on indigent defense. So the increase in the reimbursement rate was not necessarily to alleviate county financial challenges, it was to improve the overall indigent defense system. So if counties do in fact significantly improve their spending in this area, the reimbursement rate will not be 75% and 100% because there's a finite amount of money that's been allocated to the state public defender. None of that's in the second quarter projections. As I said, for right now, I'm saying and I'm assuming for budget purposes that we're going to be 9 million and 12 million, but that number is not guaranteed because the reimbursement rate is not guaranteed. And I have no idea what other counties are going to do. Embedded in the legislation is a requirement that the counties do have to, or the state public defender does have to report to the General Assembly every month what counties are what counties are spending. And so we're going to try to get our hands on that report and do some analysis of what that is going to mean in terms of the reimbursement rate. Overall, I don't expect it. I think it'll go up pretty significantly, but we just anecdotally hear some stories about some of the smaller counties, and so I don't know what this means in terms of what everyone else is going to spend their money on.
So in terms of the current estimate, are you using up 9 million for 2020 and up 12 million for 20? That's what's currently in the estimates.
It is.
Okay.
And we actually, that's based on 70% and 95%, not 75 and 100, just to be a little bit conservative.
Okay, that's reasonable. Okay, and
So sorry. Moving on, still for general fund impacts, that is the largest, but there was a slight impact that's not embedded in the numbers to the local government fund. So they did increase the percentage from 1.66 to 1.68. That actually would get us about 875,000, which is about 875,000. But they also increased the income tax cuts, so that's going to decrease the amount of money that goes into the pool from which the local government funds are allocated. So we are assuming no change right now to the local government fund. There is a separate bill that was introduced the last General Assembly and this General Assembly to nearly double the percentage. I don't have high hopes for that because of what happened last year, but hope springs eternal. So that would get us about $20 million if that were approved. The state budget also included reimbursements for medication-assisted treatment in jails, which would be great. That was an increase in our expenses over the last couple of years because we do provide that in our jail. Cuyahoga County's share, just based on looking at some of the statewide numbers, would be about $100,000 and $250,000 in 20 and 21 respectively. Not a huge amount of money, but that would be wonderful to help us offset some of the costs in the jail. Again, that's not in the projections that you're looking at. And then there was an increase in the recorder's fee from $14 to $17, which will get increased revenue for us of about $485,000 per year, and that's also general fund.
And that's also not in the projection, is it?
None of that is in the projections, no.
Okay.
So those are the largest impacts on the general fund side. I can talk about what's going to affect the levy when we move to the levy fund if you want.
Okay. And what would you consider to be a normalized amount of capital improvement to be embedded in the operating budget. You know, I know we kind of had a special one-time thing where there was an extra 20 million this year, but what would we normally do that we can pay out of operating revenue without affecting reserves, and it's part of what we normally budget for?
So with the qualifier that we've had a couple of one-time projects for the last couple of years, so the last few years haven't been normal. About $7.2 million is what we allocate for the facilities and airport capital improvement plans every year. The other capital improvement plans are not general fund. They don't affect the general fund. So we're looking mostly at facilities and the airport. Whether that amount is right or appropriate, I would have to defer to Michael Dever on that. I don't know what is needed for safety and security in the buildings to maintain the buildings so that we're not, repairing things when they already break. But 7.2 million is what's been embedded. Now, for our future projections, we are projecting shortfalls, so something in our 20 and 21 estimates is being paid for by reserves. I can't say exactly which dollar is going to come from the reserves. It might be the CIP, it might be something else. But we are projecting a $20 million shortfall. So, I can't say what's coming out of normal revenue because we are projecting deficits.
And for 20 and 21, how much CIP is in the budget?
7.2 million. That's what's in the projections. We have not finalized the budget yet, as you know, for next year, so I can't say.
So in the projection, there's not anything other than the normal 7.2, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
So along those lines, because I assume someone's going to ask at some point, although Councilman Gallagher left, so maybe they won't. ERP is coming out of this line item. It's included in our capital expenditures. Right now, we are assuming that all ERP costs are going to be paid in 2019. I don't have a lot of confidence in that assumption. And also, it assumes $27 million for the total costs, which takes into consideration the main sale agreement amendment that was approved, but it does not take into consideration any amendments to the import contract. We did that because, as far as I know, those negotiations are still ongoing. I'm not going to put in my projections what the county can pay when we're negotiating with a vendor. So just kind of keep in mind, as you're looking particularly at the future year projections, we're at 27 million for the ERP. So whatever this project costs above and beyond the 27 million is coming out of reserves.
Although we did cover some of it by transferring the money from the Harvard project, it came in under budget.
That's correct.
Because that was over 3 million.
3 million.
So that helped with some of it.
That is correct.
Okay, fine. So ERP is 27 million all in 2019, neither of which is where we're going to end up. So, but it's good to know what's baked into the current numbers we're working with. So that's good.
Right.
Okay.
Okay. Moving on to, any other questions about the general fund before I go to the levy fund? So
One more question.
I'm sorry. Yes.
My question is, I know part of it's due to the reduction in the MCO transition revenue, but what accounts for the rest of it that explains why on an operating basis we're essentially balanced in 2019, but we're 20 million short next year and 33 million the following year. What accounts for that?
So in short, we are assuming a decrease in revenue, and you're correct. A lot of that is the MCO. For 2020, there's a $4.5 million decrease just in the draw from the transition fund, and then that's going to increase to $10 million in 2021. We're also not going to get the transfer from the 0.25% fund. Now, as I mentioned, that has no impact overall in the general fund, but that does explain why revenue's decreasing a little bit. And then there's a $5 million drop in the projection for investment earnings. This year and these are treasury projections, but we're assuming 20 million, that's going down to 15 million next year. And then on the expenditure side, it's just because we assume that life, costs more money each year. So as I mentioned, we do assume a 2% increase in salaries. The general fund budget is personnel heavy, and we're assuming a 3% increase in the employer share of benefits expenses. Now, I will say, I don't want to get too far off topic, but it's not, I guess, off topic as it relates to the general fund. That increase in the benefits, we don't necessarily have to experience. The self-insurance fund at the end of this year, we're projecting a balance of $50 million. The code only requires us to have enough to cover what's called IBNR, which are effectively the claims that were incurred at the end of the year but not yet paid. And that for Cuyahoga County has been in the range of $7 to $9 million every year. The actuary assumes it's going to be about double what it is. So even if we go conservative with those actuary assumptions, we still have far more cash in that fund than we need. So we could decrease the employer share of those costs, which means not only are we not going to increase by 3%, but we could actually decrease, saving both the general and HHS levy some dollars. But that's why why the projections are going up.
Sure.
Because for right now, we are assuming that those personnel costs are going to increase.
My understanding is that the executive is planning to take advantage of that opportunity to help balance the budget. Ms. Baker, did you have a question?
Yeah, just before we get into the HHS levy, and I know we've talked a little bit, trying to learn a little more about the Cuyahoga County Convention Facilities Development Corporation.
Yes.
That manages the Global Center of Health
Yes.
Innovation.
Yes.
So there is
And the convention center.
and the Convention Center. The money that they manage, there isn't I guess, I'm just trying to learn, do we know what dollars are there that they're managing for that center? And is there an excess amount in that account that we could draw back? Okay, so if yeah, I'm struggling with this question, but.
We're all struggling with this question, so you're in good company. But let me just talk about this for a second then.
Okay.
So the county does transfer $5.4 million every year from the general fund. It used to be 0.25% fund, but now it's general fund. From the general fund to the CCCFDC, and that's it's rent payments, lease payments on the facilities. But they effectively use that to manage, you're correct, both the Global Center and the Convention Center. The agreement with the CCCFDC does say that if there is a surplus, so if their operating expenses are less than what we transfer over, that money should revert to the county in the following year. And the CCCFDC is required to do a reconciliation no later than the end of February of each year. And then if there's a surplus, that money should come back to the county. We have included that in some of our budget proposals, definitely for the last biennium. I don't think for the one before that. And then it's always kind of a back and forth, which is, I'm sure, why you're a little confused. Because it's in the projection sometimes and sometimes it's not. So here's the only thing, though, with bringing the money back. The county, so usually, and it can fluctuate, but let's just say it's about $1 million a year, because it's about $1 million a year. Okay. The county could bring that money back. That could go back into our general fund reserves, and we could be, extremely happy with that. Or that money could transfer to the capital fund, which right now the CCCFDC is holding in its private bank accounts. We have a conversation with them about having that money transferred to the county fund. It's still restricted. It still has to get spent in a certain way. But my understanding is the county has made a request for those dollars. It's the county's assertion that they should be held in the public accounts. But either way, if we take the surplus back, it's likely we're gonna have to draw from the general fund in future years to cover the capital expenditures at those facilities. So at the end of last year, I believe they had about $12 million, 10 or $12 million. I can get you the exact number. But then when we got their 5-year capital improvement plan, it showed them nearly exhausting those dollars. So, it's a long-winded answer, and I apologize for that, but I would say, no, there's no surplus, because we might as well keep that in the capital fund. Otherwise, we're gonna have to bring it back to us, but my recommendation would be to put it on reserve anyway, because those are huge facilities. They have a ton of needs. Their needs are very expensive every year, and ultimately, it's the county's responsibility.
Do you think, though, that, that 10 or 12 million at least should be under our watch?
Wholeheartedly.
So in order for it to be under our watch, would a report from them be enough, or would you want that transferred into our accounts so that we can physically see it?
I think it should be transferred into the accounts so that they are part of a public record.
Right, so what do we need to do that? I mean, what,
My understanding is that a request has been made. Last I heard, the CCCFDC board is going to make a decision. You might want to ask, Trevor's not here, but Trevor sits on their board.
Okay.
So you might want to ask him. Matt Carroll sits on the board. I can ask too, but this has been going on for several years that we've been having this conversation. And last, at least I discussed this with the executive. He and I are of the same opinion that the dollars should be in the county. Now, I cannot stress enough, they are restricted. So we get this influx of cash and it doesn't mean
Right.
we're golden. But it's kind of a nebulous whether it's public, private, but ultimately my opinion is at least these are public dollars. They should be part of a public record.
if I may, Chair, what is their reluctance if it's pretty clear that this is the way it should go? What is the explanation for why they're not just doing it because they should?
I can't answer that question. I haven't received an explanation.
Okay, well, I guess we should keep an eye on that.
Yes, we should. That's
Can you just hit
appropriate.
my phone, because I can hear my alarm going off? Okay, thank you.
Okay,
I'm supposed to drink more water right around now.
okay.
Okay,
So, Director,
yes, sir.
uh,
All right.
I'm wondering to what extent you think we do well to consider the general fund and the HHS levy fund as separate systems and balance them separately, or do you think it's better to think of them as an overall system and conceive of them together?
Just because of how I was raised in OBM, I think of them separately. They are separate and distinct funds. They have separate legal purposes and uses, and they are fungible to a certain extent, but I think that we should think about them separately as it relates to budgeting specifically. With that said, I don't think that we can consider a deficit in one fund without looking at what's happening in the areas that are supported by another fund. So in terms of strategic planning and who do we want to be as a county this year, next year, the year after that, I do think we have to look at them as a whole. But that would then include all of our special revenue funds, just what do we want to do? What do we want to prioritize? What do we value? We can't look at that and say, well, we value this for the general fund. We value this only for the levy fund. But I do believe should be some at least distinction, because the levy fund is restricted. It's a pretty loose restriction, really, but the levy fund is subject to voter approval. People have certain expectations when they vote for these levies, so I do think we have to be mindful of those expectations and plan accordingly, which means you do have to segregate the two a little bit. I know that's not a very good answer because I'm saying both, but
I think that is a good
okay,
answer.
okay,
That's
wonderful.
That's what I was hoping you'd say. I don't
Finally,
think,
finally.
I don't think we should be.
been 3
I don't
years.
think we should be moving
Yes.
the monies back and forth at will. There should be some. It should be strategic and well thought out, and I think that's important.
I think my job, I think of, is to let you all know what all of your options are. So in terms of letting you know what all of your options are, you can move the money back and forth, yes. But I agree with you. I think just optics, it's not great. And I think we also should have an understanding of when we put these levies on the ballot, this is what our priority is, this is what we value, and this is what we're going to use the revenue for. Just so that we can hopefully maintain the generosity of the voters every 4 years.
Okay, so Councilman Schwan.
I agree 100%. If there's ever a visible sign that
day.
we are moving these monies around at will, at our own discretion, and the voters voted for Health and Human Service levy dollars to go into that fund, and somehow there's ever a perception that these are clearly fungible, the very first check we write for a settlement of a lawsuit, and somebody perceives that as something that they did not vote for when they voted for the Health and Human Service levy, I think we're going to have a real mess on our hands for asking for voters in the future to support future Health and Human Service levies.
I agree with you. And every time we have a levy on the ballot, I get very nervous 6 months beforehand. Because
As do we.
these are, yeah, I'm sure, but these are a gift. And, we can count on, to a certain extent, the general fund revenue. We're always going to get some amount of sales tax. We're always going to get some fees. But the levy fund, that can get turned off in one day. So I agree that we do need to be pretty careful and consistent when we allocate the dollars.
Okay, so with that having been
Okay.
said, let's move on to the levy funds.
So, levy fund, we are projecting an operating shortfall in 2019. That means that our revenue is less than our projected expenditures. It's about, $14 million this year. We are assuming that we're going to end the year based on those projections with $9 million in reserve, which is 4% of total expenditures. As council's aware, we do have a local code that requires us to keep a 10% balance. So, we are either going to be either out of compliance with the code in 2019 as we were in 2018, or we have some decisions that we need to make over the next several months to balance this budget and maintain the reserves. I have in the slide here the children in custody chart, just to stress that this is one of the larger drivers on why we're seeing an increase in expenses, particularly in Children and Family Services. You all have been to committee hearings, various committee hearings where we've talked about this, but we have increased staffing in DCFS. They did 2 rounds of, I believe, 20 social workers each, and we have seen an increase in board and care costs. Due to the increase in placements. As of this morning, we had 2,812 children in custody. That is the 3rd highest that we've been this year, and really then the 3rd highest that we've been since probably 2007 or something. I didn't really start tracking it until much later than that, but it's quite high. And the children in permanent custody as of this morning was 617, which is the highest that it's been. And that number has been trending upward every week for several weeks now. We did have a couple weeks where the custody count went down in the last few weeks. And, we all kind of crossed our fingers, but this week that did spike back up again. And that will have an effect on the budget. You will see, I believe we have a request coming on the next fiscal agenda to increase appropriation to DCFS so that they can encumber more dollars in the board and care contracts. On the revenue side, we are projecting that revenue is going to total $245 million in 2019. There is some one-time money in that. As I discussed at first quarter, we did an advance to one of the HHS sub-funds last year that we returned to the levy fund this year. So kind of on a normal basis, revenue totals $240 million, and that's what we're projecting for 2020 and 2021. The 5-year forecast that I prepared for the full report assumed no change to levy revenue. It did assume that we were going to have a levy on the ballot, a renewal, so no increase in revenue, but it did assume, of course, that would pass. so everyone is aware that we have a levy that's got to get on the ballot. The levy expires at the end of 2020. The county has a handful of options that I've discussed in the report: renewing the levy, replacing the levy at the same millage, or replacing at a different millage. When you replace the levy, we do get to capture the increase in property values. With a renewal, you do not get to do that. And then just, I think we discussed this, Councilman Miller, when we met, but just so everyone's clear, this levy is a non-qualified levy, which means we're not getting the 12.5% credit from the state. So we don't have to worry about losing that if we did a replacement, which we would with the 4.8 mil. On the expenditure side, we are projecting expenses to total $247 million in 2019. I have an asterisk here because this is different from what we reported in our report at mid-year. This has gone down by $6 million based on just ongoing discussions that we've had with the Department of HHS, but they believe they can reallocate some additional revenue that they're getting from federal and state sources, so we can actually decrease the subsidy to Children and Family Services by $6 million.
So could you explain that in a little bit more detail?
Yes. So we have, I think, about 10, so we'll just say 10 sub-funds that capture the activity of the Department of Health and Human Services. For the most part, each division has its own sub-fund. This is back from when they were all separate departments. In JFS, Job and Family Services, the county is required to contribute what's called the mandated share. So we have to contribute a certain amount of local dollars to draw down TANF and other sources of revenue. That in 2019 is about $6.5 million, I believe. So any additional revenue that's received won't benefit Job and Family Services because we have to contribute that $6.5 million. So we have two options. Either they increase the revenue and we end the year with a large cash balance in that subfund, or we can reallocate that revenue as allowed and permitted based on the activities in the divisions to another subfund and then reduce their subsidy accordingly. So we have chosen to do the latter. We have a confirmation from the director of HHS that he will do the latter. So $6 million is going to come off of the DCFS subsidy. And that's due to additional revenue that we're receiving from federal and state sources.
So this has the impact of reducing our year-end balance in what's commonly known as the PA funds, which is actually the aggregated total of those different sub-funds. Is that correct?
That's correct. So at mid-year, we were assuming, I believe, a ending cash balance of about $16 million. And now, based on these subsequent discussions we've had, we are going to reduce one of the levy subsidies, which means that ending cash balance will be reduced by $6 million. We are projecting that subsidies are going to total $244 million in 2020 and $254 million in 2021. This assumes no change to the level of support for the Adams Board and the Metro Health System, and it does assume a 3% increase each year in the subsidies to the other funds. So remember, the majority of the expenditures in the HHS levy fund are actually subsidies to other county subfunds. And we do assume a 3% in that. And again, that's really just largely because of personnel costs. So if the cost of operating these departments is going to increase every year, so too is the subsidy.
So just an observation that the projected difference between revenue and expenditures moves in the wrong direction from 2020 to 2021 by $6 million. And this is because the revenue from the levy doesn't change, but as you just said, the cost of everything goes up.
That's correct.
And that's not at all a one-time thing. The expenses go up every year.
That's an every year thing.
You know, so I just want to make everybody aware that this this creates a serious problem in managing levies. You know, because even if you decide that that you need more money and you increase the levy and you get more money and you balance your budget and spend it on some more things. Well, by the second year you're underwater, and the third year you're underwater farther than that, and the fourth year you're underwater farther than that, and so on. And so ideally, if you're going to do an 8-year levy, which is what we're currently talking about, if you're going to do an 8-year levy, it makes sense to run a surplus in the first few years of the levy and then run it down so that hopefully by the end of the 8 years you're at least above water. You know, it creates a very difficult problem that's very difficult to explain to people just because of the fact that that we have an embedded system where your revenue doesn't go up, but your costs go up every year. Councilman Tron.
Well, your analogy is very similar to what school boards have to do every time they pass a levy. And
It's the same thing.
Same thing. The only thing I would comment on your analogy on that, Mr. Chairman, is that we are just completing, or soon to complete, $34 million for an ERP system that supposedly, when we went into this investment, was going to bring some efficiencies and effectiveness in government, and not necessarily always assume that costs have to go up every year. If we gain efficiency, we just had a presentation that we went from 500 units to 3,000 units of devices. And I can tell you, in every other business and every other organization, when you do that, there are efficiencies and effectiveness that should have been yielded as a result of increasing that by, 600%? That we increased devices, that 3,000 units, we only have, how many total employees that are actually on our books? That means that almost more than 50 or 60% of them have devices that didn't have. So there should be efficiencies and effectiveness in government that should result in lower costs.
There should be some, but my understanding is even in the very positive scenario, the savings from the ERP are more predominantly on the general fund side than the levy side.
Guess I was under the impression that we were going to have people out in the field taking information, data collection, working with people in the Health and Human Services area, that we are supposed to have gained some experience and some savings significantly in those areas.
We should get some, no question. Ms. Baker.
I think we, though, have been forewarned that there will be updates needed. As soon as we're finished with this ERP, I think we've been told that there will be additional expenses because we need to update. We won't be in the current, and that'll be a decision that we'll have to make, and I'm not sure we have much choice in how that affects our efficiencies of seeing more funds. I don't know. So I think there's a big question there as to, it would be great to see the efficiencies, but then we have to also realize that there may be more funding needed.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, Ms. Simon.
I think the efficiencies will, for at least a while, be overshadowed by the opiate crisis, which has impacted every facet of our health, almost every facet of our governing in Health and Human Service. It's not anything maybe when we anticipated to this level, that it just may be leveling off now, but I think we're just sort of mired in that equation right now.
So I'm glad you mentioned that, because I agree. And I think, were we able to compare then and now and have no change, perhaps there would be efficiencies. I think Councilman Miller is correct. And I assume he's basing that in part on things that I've said previously. But yes, most of the savings are on the general fund side. I know that council has been told that there will be huge staffing reductions in HHS as a result of the ERP. I just don't see how that's possible. And I look forward to the opportunity of being told I'm wrong and having to change my mind, but I really don't see how that's possible. I think the benefit of this system and something that is equally important as cost savings is not more important, that is that the quality of our services should improve. So when you have a social worker who goes out with no devices whatsoever, has to do a home visit, has to take notes, and then comes back and sits at her desk the whole next day and has to write notes, or God forbid she's writing them at home on overtime, now she can do those on site, and or she or he, but they can do all that stuff on site when they have the tablets with them, they have all the paperwork with them, and everything is just done more quickly. We can get at decisions more quickly. And when you're dealing with the services that we deliver that have to be made immediately because they could have literally life or death implications, the ERP is going to greatly benefit us. Keep in mind though, and I am sorry that I'm always so pessimistic, but what we are replacing right now is an HR system, a finance system, and we're replacing some of the systems in public works, or we're giving more systems to public works. I don't see how that's going to result in decreased staffing levels in HHS. The HHS fiscal staff, perhaps, but they're just going to log into a new system tomorrow. Not Famous anymore, they're going to go to Lawson, and you're absolutely right. We have to upgrade Lawson almost as soon as we're done with this project, perhaps before if it keeps getting delayed. But I don't see how we have a huge decrease on the HHS side. We should have a huge increase on the general side. I agree with you there. It's not in our numbers because I am pessimistic and have not been proven wrong yet. But, I hope that we will be, but we just don't see that yet. And the directors aren't telling me yet. Some of the directors are asking for, they're saying they're going to need additional staff because of other issues. So it's unfortunate because I know we want to say we invested $30 million or whatever it's going to be, and now we will see this offset, but we have also been completely inundated by the opiate epidemic, by a crisis in our children's services, by an increase in our aging population, and that's everything that we do. That's everything that we do. So as it is for the budget director to say, I think we should focus less on costs and savings and more on just quality. I think we should focus more on quality as it relates to this ERP. But then also remember the systems that are being replaced. We're not replacing systems in HHS. We're replacing Famous, and we're replacing BRASS, which is the budget system that 11 people use, and we're replacing SAP. So I don't know how it's going to have this dramatic effect on personnel. I think and hope and pray that we're going to be better at what we do, which could have cost savings in other areas of the budget, as we've talked about earlier, but I don't see it in personnel. I'm sorry.
Director,
And I will disagree with the results, will probably be what you say. And that's because we started from a position that we never even laid any of these goals out. We did zero, and we're still waiting for it 3.5 years into the project. And and personnel matters, whether it's HHS, should have been laid out with an expectation that we could be doing better work, better service, instead of somebody coming back and keying up stuff for a day. I mean, I watch my doctor friends dictate into it, and they're never keying anything.
Right.
And
No,
so
right.
We should be saving for every one of those days that they have to go back to their office and do something. They now have freed themselves up for a full day of doing something else, so.
I don't disagree, and I appreciate and share your frustrations, but going to Councilman Simon's point, the day that we're freeing up for the social workers, then it's just the day they don't have to work overtime. So maybe there should be a decrease in overtime, but then we also have to think of the impact on our staff when they're working all these crazy hours. Now, just going back to the upgrade, which nobody's happy about, I can tell by your face. The only good thing I will say from that is that because we have gone through this process, I feel like that upgrade process is going to go much smoother. We're going to have our goals ahead of time. Hopefully that can happen just like that, because this has been, having gone through it, this has been a heck of a learning experience doing this ERP, and we all know now the mistakes that we've made, and of course we've made mistakes, but it's been beneficial to what we're doing in the future, but I know that doesn't appease you because it was a very expensive Ms. Daly.
Ms. Baker?
I think from the beginning, at least from what I remember, the largest amount of savings was going to be in Public Works, because they weren't on any system, and they went from zero, and they were the first to get out there, to a system where they should be more efficient in what they do.
They're going to be more efficient, but Public Works is going to cost more because Public Works can now do more. Public Works also is in general fund, so I don't mean to
Yeah.
downplay them because they're perfect, but they're not general fund, so it's less exciting if there's going to be savings there. But my understanding, and again, I could be wrong, but the last conversations that I had with the director was all of the new systems that they have in place, and I don't know exactly everything that's happening over there, but it's just going to allow them to do so much more in the same amount of time. So there will be an undeniable benefit to the cities that we work with, the cities who contract with us for sewer. I'm sure there'll be some benefit personnel-wise, just because now we can, we track people and we know what they're doing.
Right.
But I actually think that Public Works are going to see their spending go up as a result of the ERP. Which isn't bad. I mean, we're doing more, and that's great. We have money to spend in those funds, but I don't think you're going to see a cost decrease.
Okay. Thank you.
Getting back for a moment to the PA funds.
Yes.
There seems to be $16 million or so per year that seems to show up in these funds, and we talked about the $6 million, how you're reallocating this money, and this allows us to reduce the subsidy in the levy. But regarding the remaining $10 million, can you give me some idea of where it comes from? Is this money where we get more state and federal reimbursements than we were expecting, or is this money where we get more state and federal assistance than we expected, or where does this money come from that doesn't seem to be in the projections from year to year, but then seems to show up by the end of the year?
So, could be a couple different things. It could be additional revenue from state and federal sources that, for whatever reason, either wasn't reallocated to the other sub-funds within the HHS family of funds, or perhaps we got it too late in the year and we had already processed our subsidies. So keep in mind that these subsidy transfers, council approves them on our fiscal agendas. We tend to do them on a quarterly basis, but even if we wait till what we consider the end of the year, we're talking about late November or early December, because we don't have fiscal agendas on the last day of the year, which would be ideal, but we just can't do that. So it could be that we're getting additional revenue. It also could be just levy dollars that perhaps should not have been transferred in the first place, but we didn't know what they were going to spend. We're mindful, due to prior year audit findings, of not having negative cash balances in these funds. In previous years, OBM had erred on the side of not putting enough money in, because we had all this cash in the levy fund, and there was just kind of an assumption that you tell the auditors effectively we're good for it because the money's over here. Well, that doesn't fly, apparently. This is why I don't talk to the auditors. So now we are putting more money in these sub-funds than maybe we need to, because we're erring on the side of making sure that we have cash. Part of the issue that we have is these contract balances. Carryover, I talk about all the time. I know everybody's eyes kind of gloss over and they don't like hearing about it, but it's an issue, because if the agencies are certifying contracts saying we're going to spend $50 million this year and they only spend 30, we have this $20 million difference. Now, in previous years, our subsidies did not cover that, and I'm talking about like years ago, previous years. We didn't cover that $20 million. We only covered the cash. But the Ohio Revised Code says that you do have to put enough cash in to cover not only expenses, but obligations. So now what's happening is we're putting $20 million, we're putting $50 million in, they're only spending 30, and at the end of the year, you have $20 million in cash. That's not a windfall. It's not great that we have money in the public assistance fund, and I use that term very loosely because the public assistance fund doesn't exist. That money should have stayed in the levy fund. It should not have transferred over. Ideally, we would like to see the agencies toward the end of the year say, hey, it's November, I've got $10 million on a contract, I spend $1 million every year, I probably don't need to have $10 million on this contract. And then we wouldn't have to subsidize as much. So the difference.
And so if you did that, then it would reduce the levy subsidy.
Yes,
And it would also reduce the so-called PA fund balance.
and it would increase the actual levy balance. So if you look at our projections from third quarter last year, which you don't really care about the details, I guess, but so at a third quarter, we said we're gonna spend, 155 million or something on subsidies. We had $16 million, I believe, or $15 million in contract carryover at the end of the year. So we didn't subsidize the $155 million I promised you we would. We subsidized $170 million. So our accuracy was completely off, which bothers me. But also then we ended last year out of compliance with the county code. And it looks like on our public reports that the levy fund didn't have cash, but we had $16 million sitting in this PA fund that nobody can see on a public report. I have been saying since I came back to the county in 2015, we need to get better at this so that the money stays in the levy fund. We have a problem in the HHS levy fund, so I'm not saying, even if we fix this problem, it's not like we don't have an issue going forward. But this is a problem we have to fix. Now, our projections assume no carryover at the end of the year. If the agencies do not liquidate their contracts, our projections are going to increase. And you'll get your $16 million cash balance or $20 million cash balance, but it's going to be because instead of spending $155 million, we're going to spend $170.
So the expenditures in the levy fund that you're projecting for 2020
Yes.
and 2021 of 244 million and 254 million respectively,
Yes.
are those numbers assuming that there's not excess encumbrances? Those are the numbers that based on your best knowledge you think we're actually going to need to spend?
Yes. And so that assumes no carryover. It does assume we'll probably have anywhere from $5 to $7 million in the PA fund every year, just because we're projecting. And so
Sure.
you're always going to have a little bit of a, I don't want to use the word cushion, but a little bit of a cushion there, just because we do have to do estimates. But yes, our future year estimates assume no carryover. So we need to either change our policies as it relates to carryover, or do a much better job estimating what gets put on these contracts, and then of course communication, which OBM and I as a director am happy to own that we can obviously probably do a better job of communicating with the agencies, but the estimates that we get are not always accurate. And so then we find ourselves at the end of the year pumping all this money from the levy fund into these subfunds, and we shouldn't have 20 million. Once we had $40 million in the PA subfund, we shouldn't have $40 million in the PA subfund. PA subfund shouldn't exist.
So my colleagues, I know this is kind of an arcane wandering into the weeds, but I assure you that it makes a pretty important difference in trying to understand exactly what we have to work with and what we don't have to work with in terms of levy funds over the next several years, so that we can make a right and proper decision as to what we should do with the next levy. So,
And based on all the information I have, based on consulting with our staff, and based on my 15 years of experience, what we have produced is an accurate reflection of what this levy fund is going to look like, less the $6 million. And I will give you a revised report. We just haven't had time to do that. So what I have in the PowerPoint is accurate. But I think these are good numbers, and I'll come up to council the second I'm proven wrong and admit it. But for right now, for decision-making purposes, I think you should be using what we have in the report.
Okay, well, those are the numbers that I'm relying on. Any other questions? Okay,
Okay,
thank you very much.
you're welcome.
Is there any other business? Any miscellaneous? Okay, well, we have, that puts us in pretty good shape for knowing where we are and where we're heading. There being nothing further that commands our attention, we're adjourned and we have a little bit of time before the 3 o'clock.